My name is Vibhuti Ramachandran. I'm a new assistant professor here in Global and International Studies. I received my PhD in sociocultural anthropology from New York University, which is where I'm coming from. And I'm very excited to be here. My research interests are, of course, coming out of sociocultural anthropology, but I also work in the fields of law and society, gender and sexuality studies, global studies, and South Asian studies. So those are my areas of interest and expertise. I am broadly interested in critical approaches to human rights, humanitarianism, and development, as well as the role of NGOs in those processes. I'm interested in postcolonial law and state practices, global legal activism, especially the kind of global legal activism that's performed by NGOs. And I'm a scholar of law and the state in South Asia, more generally. My interest in law comes from looking at law in multiple ways and across multiple scales, the local, national, and global. I approach law in the form of legislation, as well as law enforcement, criminal justice, bureaucratic state practices, the role of NGOs in shaping the law, and then also the ways in which law acts upon and is negotiated and resisted by marginalized women. And I'm especially interested in working with women in the sex trade, women in prostitution, some of whom are in it voluntarily and some of whom have been forced into it and are deemed to be victims of sex trafficking. Where I conducted my research was New Delhi and Mumbai in India, and I did multi-sided field work. This included courts, shelters where women are taken after being rescued from the sex trade. Now, some of them wanted to be rescued and others didn't, so I'm interested in the politics of that. Other field sites included rescue operations themselves, where NGOs were heavily involved and worked in close partnership with the police. I also conducted research with the police in police stations across New Delhi and Mumbai and in NGO offices. And the main interlocutors for my research were, of course, the women who were in the sex trade and had been brought into contact with the law via NGOs and the police, and also those who process these women, those who were involved in processing them through the legal system. So those included the police, NGO activists, lawyers, judges, prosecutors, and so on. And the main argument that I make in my research, my doctoral research, which I'm now converting into a book manuscript, is to say that global legal activism around sex trafficking is both constrained and shaped by post-colonial law and state practices, for one. Secondly, local moral frameworks and gender ideologies. And then thirdly, in the case that I'm studying, rescued women themselves, the ways in which they encounter the law, resist the law, learn to navigate it. And so that it's not simply a matter of global legal activism being imposed on the local, but really the ways in which both encounter each other. I'm excited to be part of global and international studies at UCI for two reasons. One is that I study sex trafficking, as I mentioned, and also labor trafficking. I have a second project which examines law and labor trafficking in India. And these are both two global issues of immense importance. And so I think that I would benefit a lot from being in the field of global studies and being in conversation with scholars in that field. And secondly, the department has hired a new group of phenomenal interdisciplinary scholars who approach global issues from very critical perspectives that I am very excited about engaging with. And then my current projects include the book manuscript based on my doctoral research, which explores law and sex trafficking in India. I also have a second project which explores the ways in which post-colonial law and global legal activism intersect on the issue of labor trafficking. And this is especially in the case of domestic workers in India who are underage. And I'm interested in the tensions between the ways in which NGO activists are channeling the global discourse on modern-day slavery to depict these young people as victims. So that's one side of the tension. And the other side are the local police who are using Indian law and have somewhat different ways of approaching issues of child labor and labor trafficking. And I have an article that's going to be coming out soon on that topic. And then thirdly, I'm interested in what is known as shelter detention or protective custody in India. One of the sites of my field research was a shelter where women rescued from the sex trade are taken after rescue and before they can go back to their families. And these are very carceral spaces where they are kept against their will, and there's an immense lack of personal liberty. These are effectively prisons. And I'm exploring ways in which this form of administrative custody, right? So it's not a form of custody that's about being under trial or being convicted for an offense. It's a form of custody that's sort of keeping you in waiting before you can be sent somewhere. It's a process, it's an administrative process. So I'm interested in how this kind of shelter detention connects with other forms of administrative custody, for instance, immigrant detention in the US, with all of the latest controversy around family separations really igniting my interest in drawing these connections. And I'm going to be teaching a class on global human rights this fall. I'm excited about that because I love working with students who want to work on human rights issues, especially in the global South. But at the same time, I want to encourage them to develop a critical perspective to human rights and humanitarianism and think critically about what the kind of interventions that they're participating in are actually doing, the ways in which they may cause harm or may not have the best interests in mind of those that they're working with, not coming out of any negative motivations, but just not being able to see the issue from the perspective of those who are being affected.